It's exciting. So I actually thought that I would start by reading a little bit of an introduction, and then I'll give you a little bit of a sense of the book and the process of the book, and I'll kind of excerpt a little bit. I'm editing down a tiny bit of the introduction so it's not too long. The beginning is a little written, I would say, but I wanted to give you a sense of the voice of the book and also how this all started, and then I'll kind of go into the journey itself. Because the book is really a journey. You know, it's a project of both history, journalism, and personal search. So, in the beginning. In my father's eulogy for my grandfather, he quoted Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch. Hard pressed on my right, center is yielding, impossible to maneuver, situation excellent, I shall attack. We called my grandfather Saba, the modern muscular Hebrew appellation, rather than the old world Zaidi, or German Opa, let alone the far too American grandpa. Born Chaim, he went by Karl. My grandfather, in my memory and in the hagiography of my family, was a bon vivant, a multilingual, well-traveled emigre doctor who lived with the joie de vivre of a man who had never been oppressed by hardship. Or maybe that's not right. With the joie de vivre of a man who had known only hardship, and then emerged from it, phoenix-like, into a problemless promised land. He was dashing, a character out of Jewish film noir, with a perfect suit, a jaunty hat, a top note of expensive European aftershave, a bottom whiff of Odol, the German minty mouthwash he imported in bulk for himself each time he returned to the continent. His appeal was not simply aesthetic. His hair, as his friends teased him, was unruly, wildly curly, clipped close to his head by middle age, always pure white in my memory, long and unkempt as a younger man, so much like my own that my sister and I would joke about our Saba hair when ours would frizz up above the hairline beyond our ponytails. His nose was a bit too big, his lips fleshy, yet he carried himself in the way of men who know they are appealing, who understand women and men, and how to win over either sex. And swoon they did. His inherent attraction was some combination of pheromones, charisma, charm, actual beauty, mystery. As much as my grandfather loved America for what it stood for its freedoms, for what it had done for him, he never seemed of this country. Certainly he stood apart from, or perhaps outside, the town in northwest Massachusetts where he settled and opened a medical practice. His English, though grammatically perfect, had the light lyrical accent of European sophisticates. He would biannually free himself from our idioms entirely for 6 weeks at a time and find his way back to Europe. The family at first remained behind. After a few trips completely alone, by 1952, my grandmother, aware perhaps of his attractions, refused to allow him to travel without her. And so they went together, their children left with a babysitter, an Italian-born seamstress musically named Rina Di Orio, whom I remember for her marvelous baskets filled with strips of silks and cottons and tweeds and synthetics, the soft kaleidoscope gleanings of her work that I would tie together into costumes well into my childhood. Karl's flight from Vienna at age 26, 6 months after the Anschluss, when Hitler swept through the city to throbbing throngs of well-wishers, and Jewish students were expelled from schools across the city, their families banished from work in hospitals, shops, parks, daily life, their world upended, was always described to me in similar grand terms. Danger, excitement, fulfillment, nothing short of remarkable. Because he actually finished his medical degree before Jews were stripped of the right to finish school, because he got out at all. And it was complete with a happily ever after ending. The entire family, or at least the core of the group, the essentials, got out safely. The story of that escape, and the way I understood it, shaped my childhood imaginings, my nightmares, my dreams. The reality of that escape shaped his worldview. It was some years after his death when my grandmother casually told me she'd destroyed my grandfather's personal correspondence. We were setting the table for dinner. They sat in a filing cabinet for 60-something years, she said. I decided that was long enough. We thought about it. They're all in German, she said quietly, derisively, but though I hissed petulantly, it's not a dead language. Really, what was the point? There was no undoing. I saved the important things, she said slyly, like our love letters, emphasis on our. What was destroyed, I asked. Oh, I don't know. Letters from Shanghai, people you've never met, people who are gone. Shanghai? People are gone. It was tantalizing, infuriating, and over time it became clear that the point of her purge was, consciously or not, to preserve the myth of the spotless escape, and in part, a carefully curated history. I'm getting ahead of myself. A few years after our argument, my grandmother was not well. She sat in my grandfather's old home office, her movements manipulated by some terrible sort of Parkinson's-like disease, as I rooted around in cabinets, asking questions about random artifacts. She had always been so meticulous in her appearance and her demeanor. The last few years of her life were a blow to that, though there were some constants. She still perfumed herself with emerald, a scent that had remained unchanged like hers since the 20s, still wore her deep pink and coral lipsticks, still pushed herself into punishing girdles and stockings and heels, her Achilles tendons shortened by decades propped up on wedges. And she hadn't changed the office or the house at all since his death, as though we, believed my grandfather would walk back in at any moment, sit down at his enormous walnut desk, and slice through the mail of the day with the long, sharp letter opener he kept for just that purpose. His marble busts of Schiller and Goethe, of Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and Theodor Herzl, sat in one windowsill. On the other side of the room, a black marble Apollo flexed his muscles into eternity. That afternoon in the cabinets beneath the bay windows where Goethe sat staring, I came across an old album, the kind with black pages and photo corners, cradling black and white snapshots with scalloped edges. The photographs ranged from formal, stiff family portraits from the 10s and 30s to the informal, crowds of laughing European teens and 20-somethings in the 20s and early 30s. There was countryside and friends, attractive girls in old-fashioned swimming costumes, and a cheerful, muscular, incomprehensibly young version of the man I'd known as my grandfather, surrounded in one photo by a dozen girls, the literal focal point, the center of attention. Among these images were dozens of tiny photos of a young woman. Your Valy was written on the back of each one in a feminine hand I didn't recognize. Here she was laughing in the grass, rolling in the grass at Vienna's old garden next to my grandfather. Here she was mugging, posed, hands on hips. Another showed the two of them lying on a bed, smiling coyly. It was shot into a mirror. There were photos of him and her in bathing suits, snuggled up close, laughing. They appeared, in the parlance of teenagers, to be more than friends. How had I never seen this album before, I wondered, turning the pages, trying not to let the paper crumble. This was his life before any of us, before even my grandmother, and it was so carefree. They looked so happy, so young, so fresh. Images dated 32, 34, 35. This was his European life, the people, the experiences he'd left behind. Tucked into the back of the album, folded into a small, tight square, was a piece of paper pasted with a series of photos the girl named Valy had taken. Each square was numbered, 1 through 4. I am so sad, says the first. They all written in German. I'm still waiting, but no letter from Carl has come yet. Here she makes a serious face. Then in square 2. Maybe this will help. If not, then not. A photo, a wistful face. She is, I learned later, quoting from a popular song of the turn of the last century, Der eine line, in square 3. But no, it would be so much nicer if he'd write again the way he used to, the way I endlessly longed for it to be. If only he'd write again at last. Her gaze is now turned away from the camera into the middle distance. By the 4th image, she is turned again to her viewer with a big smile. But maybe a letter will come tomorrow. One will surely come, won't it? The little note was dated May 5th, 1939, about 10 months after my grandfather had left Europe. I held the document up and asked my grandmother who the author was. Your grandfather's true love, she said, and offered nothing more. His what? My grandmother was not a terribly romantic woman. What a totally peculiar, what a totally devastating thing to say. I tried to press her on it, but she demurred and retired to her room. She refused to comment further. I feared to ask more. I'll show you the little note. So this is the first note. So they're 1930s selfies, right? She's taken of herself, and she sends this folded, and it's the beginning. What I don't realize is it's the beginning of a body of work that she sends to him. She writes to him from the moment he leaves Europe until the U.S. enters the war, but I don't know that yet. And I stopped digging for a variety of reasons. I sort of thought, okay, so this is a tragic story. There are many tragic stories. There's one letter. There's nothing more to know. I had called his sister right after I discovered the note, and she said Valy was incredibly brilliant. She was a student at the University of Vienna Medical School. She had come alone from Czechoslovakia to study. She had fallen in love with him immediately, and he'd ignored her. And then at one point, he realizes he too is in love. He runs to Czechoslovakia, professes his love, and they have this whirlwind affair. And she's supposed to escape with him, and instead he escapes with his family. And she writes me this note that she sends to my office at the time of the Dinner Republic and says, you should write their story. But I thought there wasn't really much to tell beyond that. And I said, okay, I'll think about it. And she sort of percolated in the back of my mind for a long time, and I thought that was it. But then my grandmother died, and we broke up my grandparents' house, and years passed, And I was living in Madrid at the time. I was working for the New York Times in Madrid, and I came back to my parents' home and I was rooting around in their basement, and I came across a box that was labeled C.J. Wildman Personal. This was my grandfather. And in that box was another box. It was a file box labeled Patient Correspondence A through G. And I opened it up, and the box was filled with hundreds and hundreds of letters, and they weren't from patients at all. They were everything he had tucked away from my grandmother. There were dozens of letters from Valy, but there were also dozens and dozens of letters from everyone else that had been in Vienna with him. And I realized at that moment, which was totally naive, I mean, that my idea that he had escaped with so many people, which was true, it was true, it was a big deal to escape with 4 people, but it was a child's idea of everyone, because a child thinks of their world as being their parents and their siblings, and a child thinks of everything within the 4 walls of their home as being their world. But in fact, he had left behind aunts and uncles and cousins and every school friend and everyone he'd ever interacted with, because though they lived an incredibly secular life in a very Jewish way, they had no non-Jewish friends, as I sort of came to discover. Their entire world was Jewish, and everyone after he left was using him or trying to use him as a conduit to leave. And at that moment, when I find these letters, I think, maybe Celie, that's his sister, was right. Maybe there is a story here to tell. Maybe there's some way to narrate one person's story amidst all these stories. Because I've always wondered what happened to regular people. What happened to Sarah Wildman's, right? I don't own bike art. I don't own that much of importance. I barely own a bicycle. But something happened to the people like me. What happened to me? You know, someone who likes to read, who's well-educated, but doesn't have any specific impact monetarily or certainly in terms of any kind of power. What happened to that person, and how did she navigate the system? And maybe that was the story I might be able to tell using her letters. And what I started out by doing was, at that moment when I found these letters, the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, Germany was just finally about to be opened. This is the last major Holocaust archive, and it had been closed for 75 years. It was the compilation of everything the Nazis had gathered as they moved across Europe, liberating camp after camp and town after town, and it all had been shoved into this bizarre fairy tale-like town in the far west of Germany, this bucolic, gorgeous, weird little village, which is ruled over by a prince named Wittichen of Waldeck, whose actual godfather is Himmler himself. And the entire town outside of the Baroque city center is former SS barracks. And in the former SS barracks, they had 17 miles of material that had never been analyzed by scholars. And so it had taken on a kind of holy grail-like quality. What was there? What could they find? And so I went with the first group of scholars, and my idea was that I would find Valy there. I thought I would go, and they would hand me a file, and it would say, here's everything you'd like to know in this file, because we collected everything on everyone. And that is not what happened. I'm going to show you another photo or two of her. So here she is, looking Dietrich-y. And here she is in Berlin. I'm going to show you, this is my grandfather in the era of them being together in Vienna with his hair. The photo people at Riverhead told me that everybody knew who he was by every photo by the hair. And here she is in the same banks. And this is that picture of him in the center, surrounded by girls. So I go there, and I do find one clue that it takes me many, many years to come back to. And I'll give you that clue, and I'll come back to it. The one clue that I found there that I did not know what to do with was someone else had come searching for her in front of me in the 50s. And I realized immediately that my idea of grandiose idea of sort of rescuing this one voice had already been, someone else had had this idea before me, decades before my own birth. But I'm frustrated. I'm extremely, extremely frustrated, and I feel like I have nothing. Even though I have all these letters, I don't realize yet how much I have. And so I go back, and I decide to start at the very beginning, and I decide to go and retrace her steps from birth through Vienna, through Berlin. And I'm going to give you a little sense of the moment I realized that I actually have a lot more than I thought I did. And I will, and then I will give you a little bit of a sense of what happens in Berlin, which is what happens in Berlin is I use her words to give you a sense of the day-to-day life. I'm going to give you this, and then here, I'll read this section first. This is in the Czech Republic, where I go to this meeting of formerly hidden children, and I realize it's all in Czech, which is not a language I speak. The day had been frustrating. I felt the keen stress of a short research trip and lost time. There was no one among these aging Czechs from Troppau, that's the town Valy was born in. And therefore, unsurprisingly, no one had ever heard the name Valérie Chastel. But then a woman, she called herself Maria Engelova, a formerly hidden child who spoke English, approached me and asked if I'd ever been to Bad Arolsen. That's where the search began, I tell her. With that, she explained she had spent years trying to get into the International Tracing Service. I asked what she was looking for. I don't know, she said then earnestly, with a strange half smile on her pillowy, moon-shaped face. If I am I. She was wearing a wool midnight blue peacoat and a man's paper boil style cap, pulled low over short gray hair. I don't understand, I said, and she explained. She was born in 1943 and hidden as an infant, and then everyone else was murdered. Everyone. Her parents, her sister, uncles, aunts, grandparents. After the war, the only two surviving relatives of this once proud family, an uncle, a grandmother, stumbled back to their hometown and found each other. A local farmer soon after asked her uncle, "Didn't you have a brother with two girls?" He told the uncle the baby, he believed, was on a nearby farm. I was found, she continued, in 1946. The family who hid her didn't want to give her up, but eventually she was brought to live with this uncle and this grandmother. Yet the grandmother perhaps never quite trusted that this girl was the lost baby tucked away, so when she was bad, or did something deserving in the grandmother's eyes, the elderly woman would murmur, "I don't know, are you you? I think you are not you." It was a seed of distrust, a fundamental undoing of the structure of her own identity that the girl turned woman before me. She was a nuclear physicist, she mentioned casually, in addition to a searcher of her own past, had internalized, swallowed whole. When I asked what she knew of her parents, the nuclear family she had only had for moments before they were sent away, she faintly shouted, "I was a small child. I don't remember anything. I don't know." And so after communism, she crisscrossed the globe from Jerusalem to Brazil, looking for anyone who might have a memory, a photo, a link that would unpack for her her own identity. You find one document after another you collect like an analyst. She became animated. When you're looking for information on only one person, she's talking about me, it's not so difficult. But to look for a whole family, she made a face that read, impossible. And I realized at that moment that I have so much, right? I've been complaining to people I have nothing. And I realized I need to go back to these letters and use the letters as the clues that they are. And what I try to do is I realize that her letters begin in 38, just before Kristallnacht, and I think about the fact that when we think of the Holocaust, even those of us who've spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about it, we think in big moments. Kristallnacht, the star goes on, and then you're sent to a camp, and you either survive or you die. But Valy's life was about everything that was happening in between those moments, everything that was happening in between, which is to say that the restrictions on daily life, if you were living in Berlin, and she moves from Troppau, which is virulently anti-Semitic, because these towns that were taken over by the Reich very early on, and Troppau was handed to Hitler with the Munich Agreement, it's part of Sudetenland, become so aggressively Nazi that they're impossible to live in if you're marked as a Jew, and you're marked, even though you're not wearing a star. She moves to the relative anonymity of Berlin, but day to day, the restrictions are legion. In 39-40, they're no longer allowed to buy new clothes or new shoes. In 41, they're no longer allowed to resole the shoes they've now had for several years. And slowly over time, more and more is taken away. Meat, legumes, fruit, jam, coffee, tea. The Jewish newspaper runs letters that say, how do you make an omelet without eggs? How do you brew coffee without coffee? And the editor-in-chief ends up killing himself because he's running these story after story after story where he's telling the community how to live a life without living. And in 40, they begin to be shoved into these places, and she doesn't write about this. All of this is subtext in her letter. She begins to be moved from place to place into these tiny apartment-sized ghettos called Judenhäuser. And the Judenhäuser were the Berlin city equivalent of a ghetto, but they would be an apartment for two people where now 15 would live, or 11 would live, all sharing one bathroom and one kitchen, and all having to get to forced labor at the same time. By the spring of 41, they're in these Judenhäuser. They have also only 1 hour to shop between 4 and 5. And if they miss that opportunity, they can't shop for anything at all. So I want to read you one or two of her letters because her voice is so gorgeous. And
she's so modern, and she cares so much more. She doesn't talk about wanting children. She's 30 at this point. She doesn't talk about wanting children. She just wants to be back with her boyfriend. She wants to live her life. She wants to live in the profession that she's trained in. She wants to be recognized as a doctor. And so I'm going to read this one, which I found an incredibly poignant part of it. This is June 7th, 1940. My beloved only one, my boy, you will be with me in this world. This one sentence in your last letter stays with me all the time, wherever I am. I can hear it, see it, and feel it always. When I'm doing what I've been doing all these days, when I'm dressing the children's wounds, when they call out to me at night, when I cannot go back to sleep afterwards, when I'm sitting by the window sick with longing, always your words, you will be with me, are comfort and torture at the same time. Because of the question, when will I be with you? Please tell me, beloved, when? I do not know the answer, and the consulate has only a vague idea of 1 to 2 years, meaning an eternity, unimaginable, inconceivable, equal to 100 years to me, who must be with you within the shortest imaginable period of time right now, and immediately. Now the third summer without you begins. Instead of going swimming or boating, hiking in the woods and sharing all the beautiful things with you, as it should be, I am sitting here pounding insanely, madly, and full of sadness at the typewriter, and the summer is so beautiful this year. But there's so much else I need to tell you. Mama has been asked to manage an old people's home in Babelsberg near Potsdam, 1 hour from Berlin, that is housed in the villa of a former Russian diplomat. The house has a dreamy location. It sits at the highest point of the town, next to the university's observatory, and it's surrounded by an enormous, completely overgrown, jungle-like, fairy kind of garden. The house itself looks like a castle, Burg in German, and everyone here calls me Burgfräulein, damsel of the castle. There's a large cupola at the very top and a blue room with lots and lots of little windows. Earlier on, this was the music room, and that's my favorite spot where I love to spend time. Here I am singing Solveig's song and all the other songs you used to love. I'm spending a lot of time sitting here and dreaming of you. And then I sometimes climb up on the roof and I go all the way up to the very top of the cupola. The view from here is absolutely spectacular. One can see villas, woods, and lakes. It's simply unbelievably beautiful. It hurts so much I have to see all this by myself, and I cannot show it to you. I will have to bring people out here. Maybe when I am not so alone and all by myself, I'll be able to forget from time to time. It's not you who can be here with me. So she writes this, and my grandfather at this moment, and this is part of it, has also been receiving letters from other people trying to get her out. 2 months before he got this letter, he received a letter from a rabbi who had been serving in Berlin, the Jews of the right. And he writes my grandfather that they know that the Jews of Stettin, which is a Baltic seaport, have been brutally, brutally rounded up. And it's a foreshadow of what's to come. They don't realize how enormous of a foreshadow it is. And they don't realize that this is how the extent of what's going to happen. But a ripple of terror has gone through the Jews of the Berlin Jewish community. And they realize that it's not just second-class citizenship facing them, that it may actually be mortal terror that's facing them. And he says to my grandfather, all you need to do is send $300 for these 2 illegal visas, $150 each for Chile. But at the same time, and this actually was, I discovered this through the help of Laura Leff, who's sitting in the back, my grandfather was receiving loans from a tiny, very little known organization called the National Committee for the Resettlement of Foreign Physicians. And they, in their files at the Immigration Research Center at the University of Minnesota, I discovered that the family was so impoverished at the moment he's being asked for $150 visas that he is applying for loans in the amounts of $24, $44, and in their notes, the social workers note that his mother has sold the last of her jewelry and they cannot feed themselves. He has nothing at all. He can barely exist in this country, even as he's trying to get a purchase and trying to find a place to practice medicine and trying to establish himself. He certainly doesn't have $300. $300 might as well have been $1 million. But it sounds like for him, even he should be able to do it. An internal correspondence between him and other people in the US, they discuss how to raise this money, but he has nothing. He has absolutely nothing. And by the time he gets the affidavit together, which is the following spring, I'll read a tiny little bit of that letter, and then I'm going to tell you one other piece of it. Other forces have come to bear. So the spring of 41, she writes to him and says, by now, you realize the restrictions she's under are so enormous, and she's still not saying any of this. a long, long time ago, you wrote to me from Vienna when I was supposed to go to Prague that one should not be so small-minded to sacrifice the present to the phantom of the future. You wrote those words in a completely different context at that time, but you were so right then. And maybe that's your thinking right now as well. And maybe you are right in not wanting to sacrifice your present, either to the past or to the future. It's, however, so terribly sad for me, because I live almost without a present, and I can live only for the past and for the future. The immediate reason for today's letter, however, is our immigration. As you all have learned from the cable that was sent 3 months ago, the matter has now become current, thankfully. So her quota number seems to have come due. The Jews in the Reich, and especially who tried to leave after Kristallnacht, which seems to be what Valy did, were held up by the quotas, keeping the numbers from Germany, what had been Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, very, very low. And it took them, if you signed up after Kristallnacht, your number was years off. A couple of days ago, we received another affidavit from Dr. Felch, who will pass on immediately. Hopefully it will suffice for the two of us. Now the additional very important question of the passage arises. It is of the utmost importance that the two passages be booked on a certain vessel and for a certain date to the U.S. It would be possible to put a down payment from the United States. The rest can be taken care of from here. What is really important, however, is that they be reserved at secure places. From here, I cannot judge which shipping company would be feasible. I've learned that the American line is sold out until February of 42. Starting from September, there may be places available with the Spanish-Portuguese line, but I don't know if this is certain. By the summer of 41, the American State Department, though, was putting restrictions on anyone leaving. She certainly had to leave with her mother, because if she didn't leave with her mother, she would be considered a potential fifth columnist, and no one was allowed to leave any close family members behind. But also the State Department had thrown up obstacles and said that they didn't really want anybody more. And they didn't want shipping companies to add any places. And when she says this ship is sold out in February of 42, what she doesn't know and he doesn't know, and what none of them knew during all of these writings of these letters, it's something I had to constantly keep in mind, that they didn't know the ending of their stories, is that in October, Germany will cut off legal immigration. So it doesn't matter if she gets herself onto a ship in February of 42 or not. There's no way for her to leave legally at that point. And I want to pause before I get back to that clue I mentioned and talk a little bit about, so this, one of the things I do as we go through this is I go to all these places that she's writing from. I'm in Troppau, I'm in Vienna, where she is a student with him, and she writes again and again about how wonderful their life was. She lives through that time again and again. And I go to Berlin, to all of these various spaces. And what I try to do is layer both the archaeology of the city and the ways in which all these spaces have been absorbed back into the city, and most of the time, there's nothing there that marks what had been taking place there. But I also interact with people now, third generation like myself, going through, and in places it's very strange. I mean, in Austria, they've just started to kind of come to terms with it, and there's a professor at the University of Vienna who has made it his work to acknowledge and honor all of the students and faculty who were expelled in 38 with Anschluss. And they only started doing it in 1999, which is incredibly late. Germans obviously have been working on this since the 60s, since the sort of what they call the 68 generation. But in Austria, I came across people who would say, maybe there was something wrong with you, and there was a reason why this took place. Maybe it was a little bit your fault. The woman that I rented from happened to have been a former skinhead sympathizer. I don't know if she'd call herself a former skinhead, but she dated a skinhead, and she really struggled with the idea that her family had been in the Gestapo and my family had been Jews, and so therefore what did we owe each other? In a way that was actually very raw and difficult. She had pictures of her grandfathers on the wall in Nazi uniform in this apartment that I'd rented, and wanted to see if I would come to an art exhibit she was putting together, wear a star as part of an art exhibit. I declined. In the Czech Republic, I found people who found as though we were sort of like fairies. It was completely bizarre to come across us, even though they were sort of obsessed with the idea of recovering Jewish memory, that it was Jewish geographic memory without actually any tangible context. You know, I had a woman who rubbed my stomach and asked me if I'd had many children as the Hebrea should do, and I felt, you know, I felt it was completely bizarre. Her husband, when I walked in, started chanting Baruch, as though, you know, that would in some way be a moment of commonality between us, which it wasn't. But at the same time, I also found many, many people who were really interested in trying to keep this memory alive and thinking about everybody from my guide in the Czech Republic to the Austrians that became very, very close friends of mine, and the Germans. What does it mean, and how do we use these stories, and how do we use this eyewitnessing from this incredible narrator, Valy, and these geographic spaces that may or may not have any indicator of what they saw? What do we use that for going forward? But the biggest point of intersection, and I don't want to give too much away, was that so I went back 2 years after I first found out that someone else had come looking for Valy. I went back to thinking about how to find that person, and I started placing classified ads. And that's what people did after the war. They didn't have, this woman had no digital footprint, right? She wasn't Googleable, she wasn't in any online database. And what they used to do after the war was they would place classified ads, looking for the lost, in the way that we did after 9/11, putting up posters. These were classified ads in newsletters for mostly the refugees from the German-speaking parts of Europe. And the Aufbau was so enormous in the 50s that the West German government broke the news to the Aufbau instead of the New York Times that they'd be giving indemnity payments to victims and survivors' families. The other one was called the Association of Jewish Refugees Journal. It was out of the UK specifically, and the woman had been writing from London. So I put the ad there. I put an ad in for everything I knew. This woman was searching between 55 and 65 or so, and I knew because I'd gone in search of her search. Within my search, I folded it in. I went to all the various organizations and archives around Germany that she'd requested information from, and at one of them, she'd given the news that she had children. And I listed the years her children were born, and I asked for any information for the searcher. And I forgot. I put the ad in because I figured nothing would come of it. I don't know who reads these things anymore. And a couple months later, I went to Europe for a conference on something totally different. And I had begged them to let me stay the Saturday night and not have to go home after 2 days in a conference room in London. And they agreed. And so that Saturday night, in between going to like a museum and dinner, I checked my email and I get an email saying, "Imagine my overwhelming emotion. You're looking for my mother." And I'll pause there. I'm going to open it up to questions a bit because I can go on and on. But can I open it up? Questions? I can read another letter if you want, but yeah.
How long did it take you to write this book, or the whole process? How many years?
6 years. Yeah, I mean, more or less. I mean, it was longer ago if you include finding the letters, but really the active process is 6 years. And then I've probably been actively writing for 2 of them, but throughout I was writing bits, but the research took 6 years.
I'm wondering if you could tell us, without giving too much away, whether your research brought you to see a different dimension of your grandfather than you had thought about or seen before when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yes. I mean, the impoverishment when we first got to the United States was something we'd never, ever really heard anything about. And also the ways in which small decisions by other people affected the course of his life, where he settled, the type of medicine he practiced, and really the incredible duress that he was under both before the war, during the war, and then after the war. There's a whole part of the book about the post-war conversations between relatives and friends and those who've experienced the worst of the horror versus him, who's gotten away relatively unscathed, right? He ends up joining the U.S. Army, and he wants to be in Europe. He has this idea that he'll be in the ski corps. He speaks 1 million languages, and he is, of course, sent to the Pacific, which is not, had nothing to do with any of the languages he spoke. He was in a MASH unit in the Pacific, and we don't even know that much about that. And the peculiar part for me, which is interesting, is I went to try to figure out more about his Army service, and the U.S. archives were burned in St. Louis in 1973, and there's nothing. So here I found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages on people living in the Reich, and I could find nothing about his military service, which was bizarre. I have this, he wrote a paper that won a major award on malaria, and he came back and lectured about it. So I have 100 million copies of it, because he kept 1 million copies, and a lot of correspondence about it, but nothing about his service. But the book really, though the structure of the book is really kind of 3 people, I mean, primarily him and Valy, and then a bit me, the book is really about Valy. And because I think that the important piece of this for me was
that the Nazi experiment was not just to exterminate, it was to erase. Before this whole project began, I had worked on a story about forgotten camps in Paris. And in the middle of the war, between 41 and 44, more or less, there were 3 camps in the heart of Paris itself. One in the 10th, one in the 1st, and one at Austerlitz, the train station. And they were tasked with sorting and redistributing all of the goods of the Jews being deported from Paris. And the French moving companies were employed by the Gestapo. They would rush the apartments where Jews were deported from. They would pull everything out. They would bring them to these depots, and Jewish slaves would rush the trucks and take everything off. And everything on the trucks was then reorganized. Anything reusable, armoires, plates, cribs, was repackaged and sent by train into the RAF for bomb victims. And anything personal, they were told to burn, to render these people literally unmemorable. And it just really stayed with me. It both stayed with the survivors who I interviewed. They had this strong sense of horror at the fact that they were witnessing, they realized at some place along the line, these people were not expected to return, but also they were not expected to have made any impact on the world. And there's small bits of sabotage was to try to save a photograph, a journal, anything. And for me, this became a little bit about what this project was, right? Which is, can you rescue the words of somebody? And is that in some way undoing that erasure process, even if it's not more than that? I mean, then that question of blotting out, and of course, you know, we spend so much time thinking about this period, and we think in these large numbers, but sometimes the large numbers take away a bit of the individual experience. So the question is, can you go back now and tell bits of this individual experience in a way that at least in some small, tiny manner counters that erasing effort? Yeah.
So you talk about at the beginning your grandfathers returning to Europe after the war regularly and for extended periods. How many, if any, of these relationships from before the war did he resume? Did you know about it? Could he have written this book because he had all this information without having shared it before he died? Did he know Valy Spade and what, you know, and all the rest? And did it go the other way? You know, say you tantalizingly at the end, you're looking for my mother.
Right.
Did your grandfather know this woman who was looking for?
Right.
Yeah.
So some of his relationships do reconnect. Right after the war, towards the end of the book, I have this chapter on that post-war recrimination sort of letters that he receives. He receives a super brutal letter from this woman named Lotte, and she's actually the daughter of his half-brother, but they're the same age because his father had married twice, and the other family, it's complicated. But in any case, he and his niece basically were more or less the same age, and they'd been very close before the war. And she writes in this letter saying, basically, have you forgotten us? You have not asked what's happening with us. Well, I'll tell you. You know, my parents are dead. My husband is dead. My sister's husband is dead. I mean, it's really this litany of the dead. And you know, and we're angry, but we don't have the luxury to be because it is too painful to be alone in this world, so we need you. And she and her sister are left. And she also says in this letter, and this is actually something I struggled with the German, I had a million people look at it, does it say that she also lost her oldest son or her oldest brother? It's like this debate about how the German reads. It sounds to most of my native German-speaking friends that she says that she's lost a son. And I tracked down, she has another marriage after the war and other children, and I tracked down one of the children, and he had not known this. She'd never spoken of another marriage. He had discovered this as a child, and she'd been told never to discuss it, but he'd certainly never known if there was another child. He had known nothing of her experience. He had been told never to speak of any of this. But the peculiar thing is both he, I mean, beyond the fact that I exposed something incredibly intimate to him, which is horrible, he and my aunt and my father, they all say, but Lotte and Carl were so close. They loved each other. This woman who writes this incredibly recriminating letter, you've forgotten us, you didn't do anything for us, you abandoned us. By the 50s, when they're all sort of age, you know, my father was born in 46, all they remember is them getting along. So yes, he reconnects with a lot of these people. And I know that through HIAS and other places, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, he does search for Valy, but I don't know what he knew exactly. I know that her name was known to people. I don't know what he knew. I don't know if he knew anything about this woman that I had come across in London. I don't know what he knew of that because that's not in any of his files. What I do have is that these relationships that are frayed, and you realize 12 years have passed by the time he's getting some of these letters, right? And he's getting these letters, some of these letters are 1950, and he left in 1938. I mean, he leaves as a 26-year-old, like at the end of medical school, and now by the time he's getting some of these letters, I mean, even 46, let's say, 8 years later, he has a son, he's now married, he marries in the middle of the war. My grandmother, he has gone to war, and all these people have lived in Europe. They've gone through a lifetime of experiences, and most of them do reconnect. And I found his correspondence with his closest friend, which begins then, it goes through the end of the 80s, and that actually provided for me a lot about what he was feeling and doing and thinking, and the ways in which he felt constantly sort of outside American society. But to some degree, I think a lot of them chose, once they made their reconnections and whatever peace they made with what they had done or not done for each other, they chose to sort of close the door on it. And what Latte's son said to me was, it wasn't explicit, but it was implicit and constant, that you did not ask questions. He's like, it's so easy for you to ask questions. You were born so much after the war. He was born in 1950, and he said, we were not to ask. It made her too upset. We were not to ask anything. And she only died relatively recently, which killed me because she lived certainly well into my search, and I didn't realize it until late. We were not to ask. And he and his brother lives in Israel, and I went to Israel and interviewed him. They knew very little. I mean, there's all these sort of tributaries, like little stories I tell throughout the book. I mean, for example, there's a first cousin of my grandfather's who lived with him in Vienna, who's in the Warsaw Ghetto. And his story, too, is dramatic and horrible. And it's not clear to me what his children knew. And it's only now, with this generation asking questions. And it's hard, because, of course, most of the eyewitnesses themselves are not here to talk to them, so we're using their documents. But I think he went back originally looking for survivors. I think that's why he started going back alone. He first went to Europe, and then went to Israel, and then back to Europe. And partly he went back because he loved Europe. I think he would have preferred to be in Europe, but he never felt fully secure there. I didn't know this until I was in my late teens, but he had created bank accounts in other countries because he never felt secure, even once he'd made money in this country. And they always had passports, and they always were ready to restart if they had to. Yeah.
I mean, I know that, you were just saying this story is really a Valy story, and a little bit less so the others, but, and maybe this is picking up a little bit on some of the things you were just saying, but I'm wondering about particularly, so this was your father's father, right?
Yeah.
So your father and your aunt, and I'm wondering about their role in this and reaction to your growing knowledge, kind of how much they knew, because they're approximately the same generation as this cousin you were just mentioning, who was told not to ask anything. And so I guess, where does that intermediate generation in your family fit into this story?
They knew some things, but similarly, a lot of this is revelatory to them. I mean, certainly the stories of impoverishment, post-war pre-war, post-immigration impoverishment, they had no concept of at all. They knew some of these names. I mean, my aunt wrote me this long email when she finished the book saying, why didn't we ask more? I think everybody feels like that, I mean, I feel like that, even with his sister who lived for a very long time. And one of the things I say in the book, excuse me, is that I interviewed his sister for the Holocaust Museum, like with an official thing, with the beautiful audio equipment, like from NPR, with that awesome absence of sound thing that NPR does. And I did it too early in my own trajectory because I was so sure of the narrative, and I just kind of wanted to get it in her voice, that I don't pursue lines of inquiry that I now hear. I hear her opening things up that I don't push. And I think, oh, what, I hear, she says in this interview, this is before I found the letter, so it was in my early 20s, she says, he was supposed to escape with his girlfriend, but then he escaped with us. And I don't ask, why? Wait, what does that mean? What do you mean? What are you, who, what? What's the girlfriend? What are you talking about? I don't ask that, I just keep going, so how did you get the visa? Da, da, da. The stories I knew, but I just wanted her to have on tape for us all to have. But I was so sure of the kind of imprinted narrative we had all embodied that I didn't push further until I went back to it as a journalist, researcher, as I sort of kind of took myself out of the family structure and looked at it as I would if it was a story. All of a sudden I thought, oh my God, I can't, and you know, it's a lovely interview. It's just that there are all these tentacles, you know, that I don't follow up. So I think that that was true for us. I think that they had stories, and remember, you know, one of the things I think is interesting around the idea of oral history itself is, of course, our memories become worn and smooth. It's like the same, you know, we tell stories again and again and again. You know, it's true for small stories like, you know, one summer my parents had a motorcycle and my mom burned herself on the cylinder or whatever. I've heard that story 50,000 times. I have never asked further, like, whose motorcycle? What do you mean? I mean, I didn't ask anything. You hear the one anecdote and you tell it again and again and again and again, and you don't ask a lot. And I think that happened even with this, even though it's so dramatic. And in part, I think my grandfather, like all of us do, you know, sort of curated his story, and it was in part in service of this idea of him being this big success. Even the stories of his own impoverishment in Vienna, he wasn't wealthy in Vienna, were told in a kind of funny way, you know, in a kind of such a lark, you know. He didn't tell stories of the imposition of anti-Jewish laws in Vienna, even though his sister did. And it must have been brutal and horrible to be in Vienna after Anschluss, because all of those, as you know, the restrictions were imposed in 6 weeks that had been incrementally imposed from 33 on in Germany. But that's not how he described it. It was more like the intrigue of getting out, the visa, this, but not the 6 or 8 months or whatever that they lived under these restrictions where parks were taken from them and they couldn't walk where they used to walk and they weren't allowed back at the university and they lost their job. It's not what he talked about. And somehow I guess it was subtle or not even subtle that you weren't really supposed to ask the harder questions.
How much do you think this narrative that was imposed, not sort of prejudging the question, I shouldn't do that, but you know, I mean, one of the things that my students have found is when they looked at oral histories of German, Austrian immigrants, is they almost never say any, are either asked or say anything about the people they left behind. So I think that's kind of common. Mm-hmm. How much of that is coming from what the expectations of America was, and how much do you sense this is coming from the immigrants themselves? I mean, did they think they had to feed a particular narrative that was being constructed in the post-war world?
I'm sure it's both. I suspect that it's both, but I think that part of it is, I mean, I say this in the book, I think that if you were to question their success, you're opening up something that's so incredibly painful. I mean, my aunt did say that a brother-in-law was left behind, who they'd asked to come. I don't know. I think that in part, remember, this country didn't talk about survivors and things in the post-war period in the same way we did after 1979. I mean, the way we think of oral history is really something that comes into play in the 80s, in 79 and later. And so, and actually what I did for the book was I went back to a lot of the early testimonies taken, which are very raw and brutal, in DP camps, for example, in the early years. But we didn't do that so much, in part because I think it was a way of sort of forcing everybody to move on, and in part because it was so raw. I think that the refugees themselves, I mean, look, it is tremendous to have brought out 4 people, 5 people. It is huge, a huge number of people that have gotten visas for. And maybe you couldn't think of it as having been a failure in any way. You had to, I mean, I think he purposefully chose to look forward and that looking backwards for him would have been to have lived forever in sadness, which I think a lot of people did do, and he didn't want to do that. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think
But I think it was a mix of both the choice of not, I think as the news was trickling out and as more and more people understood what it meant to have left those people, that was such a brutal burden. And there's a line I have at the very, very end of the book, which is that, the idea of blame has no meaning here, right? Because it's not their fault they didn't get them out. It's the Nazis' fault that they wanted to exterminate them. What were you going to say?
I want to just turn to the conversation, because I think the issue of blame is very powerful, and it's both guilt but also ambivalence about America.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm a second generation survivor, and these survivors had immense gratitude to America for everything that it enabled for them and those who got out, and immense anger at America's failures. They couldn't raise $300 because he was so poor, that America had closed the borders. In my father's case, he just had immense ambivalence about hearing the American planes overhead for weeks before Buchenwald was liberated, and one airplane could have bombed the extermination. So this feeling that America was culpable, hugely culpable for their own losses, even as they were infinitely grateful to America.
Right.
I think that was a piece of the story here.
No, I think that's right. There are these moments in letters where they talk about how much they love Roosevelt, right?
My father loved and hated Roosevelt.
Well, I'm not surprised. But if you think about it, so this letter he gets in the spring of 1940, which says the Jews of Stettin have been deported, and the Jews of Baden have been deported as well, right? So this is a year before the final solution is decided. A year, right? And it's at that same summer that the State Department says, we will throw up every obstacle to refugees coming out. There is no reason to create more spaces on these ships because we're not letting anybody in. And State Department internal memos from Vienna say people are sitting in my office sobbing and we have nothing to offer them. And so to feel that people said to me all the time, are you angry with him for not doing more? This is the exact moment that, first of all, the Otto Frank letters that were found at Evo a couple of years ago in 2007 showed that he was friends with the heirs of the Macy's department store fortunes, and they couldn't do anything on his behalf. This is my grandfather, who is no one, not much as he would not like to have thought he was no one, but he certainly was no one compared to the Macy's department store fortune, and if they couldn't do it, So I think you're right. I think there's a huge ambivalence about what was allowed and what wasn't. At the same time, it's impossible not to feel responsible for people who are writing you saying, and also to have this sense of for the grace of, for example, there's a letter I excerpt that is written by an old school friend who is deported from England to Australia and put in an internment camp because they started deporting German-speaking refugees to Australia. And he was left in this camp for a couple of years. These tiny tributary stories of these horrors. And he's writing to my grandfather saying, you might be surprised to hear from Australia. Well, this is what's happened. I'm quite bored. Can you send me some medical school textbooks so that I can keep up my work? And it's just like, here's this guy who's finally escaped, and now he's in the desert in this internment camp, and yeah, he's lucky, right? Because he's not dead. The idea of this stuff is so bizarre, and the things that they went through, and all these things my grandfather doesn't have to go through. And I do think that there's something that you can't, I'm sure that for him, he couldn't carry that sense constantly of his own, of other people having experiences and he got away with not having to do. I just don't think you can carry that and not lose your mind in some way, right? So I think his sense of moving forward was important. But yes, it's complicated because, of course, had more of these visas been issued, had more of the, more ships been sailed, had more seats been arranged, why not? It's not like they didn't want to leave. I don't know. And I think it's complicated now, too. I think what's interesting for me is, of course, you're reading the State Department documents, and it is this complicated legacy on both sides of the Atlantic, right? And I think what's interesting, going back to this idea of the third generation, I think in all the countries I was in, I was in London as well, but in particular in the Czech Republic and in Vienna and in Berlin, there's a strong sense of a number of people who are trying to see how to honor what took place in these places. So in the Czech Republic, the the guide I'd worked with, he was working on resurrecting the last remaining synagogue in the region. Every other synagogue had been burned. There are no Jews there, but they felt that they needed to recreate it, and it's quite beautiful. You know, and in Vienna and Berlin, there's this process of these Stolperstein, you know, these stumbling blocks where they honor people who lived in each of these places, and it's incredibly moving because they're these little glittering bronze blocks that show, you know, this person lived here and was murdered. And to me, it was one of the more dramatic memorials to come across. Any other questions? Yeah.
I want to know about what it was like to live so long with Valy and her letters. I mean, her voice is so magnificent, as you say, and so she's so real, and you sort of, it becomes like your friend as you read it. But I was wondering what it was like to live with that, and what it was like to finally finish the book and have to kind of say a goodbye of your own to her.
I think this is something I'm really struggling with still even now. You know, I do think part of the reason why Valy is such a strong character and was such an important search for me is because she sounds like someone who could be my friend. She doesn't sound like someone far away in like a black and white photograph. She sounds modern and lovely and flawed and interesting. I think actually what was very hard, and I was just talking about this with another author of a similar kind of book, is that you're reading so much about trauma and you're reading so much about the things that they're going through. I had at some point to stop reading around 10 o'clock at night after a while because I was having nightmares. I mean, it was very hard not to really over empathize. You know, I made this joke the other day, but it's really true. I feel like this is going to be my therapy for the next 5 years, is sort of trying to kind of understand, like, that becoming her conduit actually was very emotionally draining. And it was hard because I kept hoping for more. You know, I felt like I couldn't stop searching. I couldn't stop looking for something. I couldn't stop looking for one more letter. Had I missed anything? Was there anything else that I could find that she'd said? You know, I didn't want there to be a finite number of letters.
Does anyone have one last question before we wrap up?
We're going to show one more picture.
Oh,